Now, when we come on to policy, because I mentioned also that it's probably something that's messed around a lot with in terms of policy. We make a distinction between dualist or marginalist approaches and non-dualist or structuralist approach. So in other words, approaches that see the informal economy as something that needs to be developed separately perhaps, or something that needs to be integrated, so something that needs to be taken into the formal economy. And what you've had over the last few decades is you've had sort of vacillations between those two views. One instance, there's this view, and for example, the ILO have driven parts of this, where there's a need to look at how you might develop the informal economy maybe as a separate entity almost. Or to what extent can you integrate it within the formal economy? For example, it does seem to be in South Africa at the moment, the policy to integrate this, to bring more people in to become taxpayers, for example, and pull them into the formal economy. So the informal economy has been associated with marginal activity and survival strategies and underprotected employees. I think we mustn't forget that aspect, that there's a certain extent of marginalisation. And there's also, if you look on the dark side of the informal economy, underprotected employees and worse. But also there's this, and this is, one of the things that I looked at previously in my previous study, but the failure of modernising development strategies to sort of, to pull economies forward, to develop economies. So if, let's say, if organisation and management within the formal economy may be inappropriate to, let's say, workers that come in and say, look, I'm stepping outside my culture. And if it doesn't really supply the answer to development in Africa, then what about the informal economy? And one of the more recent studies that I've looked at the NGO sector in South Africa, there does seem to be a lot more synergies between, local NGOs and communities. They seem to be, not all of them, but they seem to be more part of the local community. They seem to be serving more the local community. And the appropriateness, if you like, the way that those organisations are seen by the local community and the way that they're seen by employees are far more compatible, if you like, with African community cultures. But I still don't know what the situation is in the informal economy because, would that be the case? Would we find more authentic, although I hate that word, would we find more authentic management, organisation within the informal economy? And that's the bit that I'm really interested in. So in terms of propositions, okay, and these are quite loose at the moment, but in terms of propositions, the informal sector is more aligned with local culture. And this is one of the things I think that, it will have policy implications. Institutionally more reflective and supportive of organisational members' cultural identity, therefore appropriate to community stakeholders in the way it does business and the nature of employment. So how we define entrepreneurship and how that entrepreneurship connects with the local community and what those organisations actually do for the local community, how they're placed within the local communities, and the relevance, the type of employment and so on. But also bearing in mind that it's exploitative and marginalising aspects, which we can't forget. But the other thing is, because there seems to be a lot of development of national and international associations. They're not always driven by the people within the informal economy. For example, StreetNet. I don't know if any of you have come across StreetNet in South Africa, but they also claim to be an international organisation and linked with such organisations in India and Latin America and so on. But they seem quite big in South Africa and other countries. But StreetNet, I thought, well, maybe if we go for an organisation like that and work with them, and they're representative of street workers, for example. Maybe I shouldn't say street workers, should I? Retailers, street sellers and so on. But if they're representative of those, maybe that's a way into to these organisations. Maybe through such organisations, such wider associations, we might have access as researchers to those people working within the informal economy, entrepreneurs and so on. But I mean, for example, StreetNet, it turns out to be, it's actually an NGO that was created by a lady in Durban. And it's not really a membership organisation as such. It's got quite a big voice in many respects, and it does encourage street sellers, street traders to join trade unions. But apart from that, it's not really an organisation that is representative of informal workers or entrepreneurs or whatever. And there are other organisations similar to that, but there are organisations that probably have developed from participants within the informal sector. And I think the important thing for that is that as people get a bigger and better voice, because one of the problems of the informal economy is this lack of voice within policy making and so on. To what extent do they compromise their authenticity? To what extent do they then sort of get sucked into the global economy, if you like? Because we've noticed this within the NGO sector, for example. NGO sector, CBOs developing from the community, they have to seek funding, they have to get funding from the big funders. And that seems to compromise their interests in working with the community. It tends to compromise, the way that they have to write funding proposals, the hoops that they have to jump through for large international organisations, etc., etc. That seems to compromise their position. And what I'm wondering is that as the informal economy, or organisations within the informal economy, as they scale up, or as they become part of something bigger, would they therefore lose their authenticity? Is that a possibility? And you've got this constant interaction, of course, as I mentioned before between the informal economy and the formal economy. And there's tensions between them. There's connections, there are alliances made between them and so on. And this to a certain extent represents conflicts and resistance, and how can we study that? How do we study the cultural space that is developed? Because culture for me isn't something that's there, it's solid, it's unchanging. We can no longer, for those of you that know Hofstede, we can no longer really speak in terms of this is the culture of France, or this is the culture of Germany, or whatever it might be. It's just, I wouldn't say it's nonsense, because it did a lot of things for my sub-discipline within management, but it's constantly changing, conflict, resistance, cultural cross-vergence, hybrid forms of organisation. In post-colonial theory, we talk about the third space and how these conflicts and resistance create that third hybrid space. And how can we actually study that? How can we look at that? But also, it's not, and I think I was hinting at this before in the previous point, that it's not necessarily a cosy dialogue between different people. It's not simply a cosy dialogue between, let's say, a street trader and a trade union, or a street trader and somebody like StreetNet or whatever. There's power dynamics involved there. There's power dynamics involved between the informal economy and the formal economy, between governments and what they do in terms of policy towards, for example, street traders. So there's a power dynamic there. So if we're going to study the informal economy, we also have to incorporate that power dynamic, and we also have to consider what arises as a result of that power dynamic in this interaction between various parties that have got different interests. What actually comes out of it. And for me, as a cross-cultural specialist, this is really, again, the bit that I'm interested in.